After an amazing German Grand Prix, one of the strangest stories to come out after the race was a big penalty for the two Alfa Romeo drivers that dropped them out of the points. And this was related to their clutch settings at the start of the race. And I've got the FIA decision here. Interesting terminology. Talks about breaching rules that are effectively there to prevent teams potentially mimicking traction control. Now, that's not something you hear very often anymore in F1. Traction control feels like a bit of a retro rules break, and I've got Jake Boxall-Legge here to try and explain what went on here. So JBL, we know that the Alphas had something wrong with their clutches, but what exactly did they do wrong, and why did it put them into the realm of, breaking what are effectively traction control rules?
So it took away quite a good result from them, actually, because they came 7th and 8th, but they were hauled up to the stewards after the race, and it emerged that when the drivers had dropped the clutch at the start, what was being asked of the engine didn't necessarily match up with what was being asked from the clutch action. So there's a limit that you can have. It's the torque demand must meet the torque developed by the engine within 70 milliseconds, and after that they must be exactly the same. After the race, it turned out that Raikkonen's car had taken 200 milliseconds for torque demand to match the torque. It took Giovinazzi's nearly 300 milliseconds. Now, we're talking about fractions of a second here, and it's such tiny margins, but this is still something that's going to have an effect, especially in wet conditions as well. So the longer it takes the torque to meet that demand, it's kind of a gradual movement, and it lessens the wheel spin. In wet conditions, that's a huge bonus, because, as you say, it's like mimicking traction control. It's limiting that wheel spin. It's making sure that the driver's not going to wiggle about off of the line. It means that they're able to just essentially get on with it. And you do have that better start in wet weather. So that's what happened. Obviously, the stewards deemed that they'd gained an advantage from it. Alfa perhaps thinks differently on this, but ultimately they were bumped down, given a 30-second penalty. It was a post-race 10-second stop and go, which was converted to 30 seconds.
There's no question that Raikkonen in particular, who was up the front of the grid, made a very good start. He got into turn 1 third, and you could see that Max Verstappen, for example, had loads of wheel spin and could barely get the thing moving. So that's why these rules exist. Now, the teams are always checked to make sure they've complied with this rule. So it'd be a strange one for Alfa Romeo, just because it was wet, to say, let's play around with the clutch settings. So what was the team's explanation for why they broke this rule?
So the team said that there was, and it came about as a result of the formation laps under the rain. They said that there was a discrepancy in the clutch. They suggested that because they hadn't done any starts in wet weather, that had contrived to, lead them to put the wrong parameters in. And so when they got that getaway, it led to that latency between torque demand and what was asked from the engine when the driver hit the accelerator. So that was their explanation for it. They've argued that, lack of practice starts, wrong configuration. They believe they've got enough evidence to appeal that decision. So we expect them to go and do that. They're hopeful that they can gain their 7th and 8th place back. So it's quite an interesting situation for them. It's not something you really ever see.
And do you think that explanation is credible? Because as I mentioned before, it would seem a strange thing to do deliberately. So is this just a massive slip-up?
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's something they check, and as we discussed earlier, it seemed like a huge difference between what was asked and what Alfa ended up producing. So if you're going to cheat, why do it so obviously? Surely you'd play with the settings a little bit and go a tiny bit over, and then perhaps claim there was like a spike or something, rather than go way above what's allowed by the limits. So that's the reason why I would suggest that they didn't intend to do it. But at the same time, as we've said, it's a huge advantage in these wet conditions to have something that isn't quite traction control but gives you the similar effect. So personally, I'm sitting on the fence, as I always do in these videos, but it wouldn't surprise me to see Alfa's appeal sort of thrown away, because it's just such a clear breach of the regulations. I don't really know how you can prove that there was some kind of glitch in the system that makes it all okay. I don't think it was an intentional cheat, but I could see where it's coming from if it was. Next year, this is going to be a lot harder to do. A lot more power is going to be given to the drivers with regards to clutch regulations because they're changing for 2020. There's not many changes for 2020, but this is one of them. So the clutch paddle, which you see there, that's going to have to move linearly with what is being demanded from the driver. And so you're not going to have quite as much latitude to play about with your settings, change that latency, give yourself a chance to not give yourself track control but emulate it. So a lot more control is being given to the driver for next year. So yeah, there's not going to be much scope to mess about with that kind of thing.